Howdy, y'all. You're listening to The Fixed Star. My name is Sam Bass. I am once again joined by my co hosts, Jacob David Glenn and David L. Hudson Jr. In this episode, we explore the following hypothesis that one of our most significant cultural dilemmas is the pervasive preference for style over substance. We investigate this hypothesis by analyzing how it functions in areas of our society like music, sports, and television. Now, I previously referenced the style over substance proposition as a hypothesis because at this point, it's exactly that. This conversation is a crucial part of fleshing out this hypothesis and subjecting it to further scrutiny, seeing if it holds water, and moving forward in its development. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, so as Sam mentioned, this week on the Fixed Star, we're going to be talking about style over substance. This is an idea that I've had for a long time, just sort of kicking around in various iterations. And I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that really hit this thought, this idea on the head. And it inspired me to say, you know what, I need to go ahead and write this down, just take a stab at doing this. And incidentally, I just finished reading another book this week, uh, unrelated, other than in its style. It's called "The Story of B" by one of my favorite writers, Daniel Quinn. And in this book, there's someone who's trying to teach a lesson to another person, and they say, "I don't have the ability to lay this out cleanly in a well planned manner, but I would like to. I think I can present some pieces to you to create a mosaic by showing you various iterations or various contexts or examples of this thing I'm trying to communicate. I think by the end of it, it'll paint a clear enough picture to communicate the message I'm trying to communicate. So, again, the proposition is that among our chief issues in society, our Western society today, is a preference for style over substance. And what I'm going to try to do, and what we are going to try to do, is to present some different places where that pops up to try to use those by way of example to show what we're trying to talk about, what we're trying to communicate. And we also hope this conversation is going to be a way to develop this idea further. So I'll start where I first had this thought. And this thought came to me when I was playing country bands in Dallas after I graduated music school. I came back to Texas and kind of had a little bit of an ego as a musician and really thought I was kind of hot stuff. To be totally frank, it's embarrassing to say this 10 years later or
Did
however
you
long
say
it's 8 years later.
did you say had an ego?
Well, yeah, right. Anyway, ego presence or not, notwithstanding, at that time it was indisputable, and I thought I was pretty hot stuff. And I'd play this country bar, and I'd be ripping, and people would be like on the set breaks, would be like, "Man, that's like you're great, that's awesome." And I was like, "You know what, man, you're right." And I kind of had that thought. But one night, something interesting happened. We're playing at this country gig, and we kind of would dress the part. We wear the hat and the stuff, and do the Texas thing. It was Texas after all, and this girl came to sit in one night, and she like looked the part, and she was gonna sit in on a fiddle, and she had the boots, the big belt, and kind of had that like the flannel country shirt tied, and was looking great and indisputable, also just looking hot. Had the whole kind of, honestly, after coming back from Nashville where I was, she kind of had that like Nashville country vibe, to be honest with you. But when she came up and played, it was the playing was not at all commensurate with the image that was there. But I noticed that in spite of the fact that she went into some comping, some solos, did a little this, a little that, like it just was not tasteful. It was not good. It did not sound good. But nonetheless, everyone in the crowd is eating it up, loving it. It's awesome. And then I hear on the set break people saying kind of the same compliments that I would get sometimes on my playing. And I realized, oh wow, maybe I have kind of allowed some uh un I realized maybe I should put less stock into what drunken people say to you at a bar, which seems very obvious, but I was 22 or 23 at the time, so I think that's all that needs to be said about that. But so I realized, wow, maybe a big part of what was effective to the crowd was that this girl looked like the real deal. She looked like the real thing, even though her playing was not no intention to rip on her, but I'm just saying as a matter of fact, her playing was not great. So the next week I thought, you know what, I'm going to test my playing. I'm going to test the interaction that I'm having with the crowd. And I came in, and what I did is I was like, all right, I'm going to play every solo a half step out of key. And for those who aren't musically savvy or familiar with the theory of music, if you play there's something very strange about a note that's a half step off. It sounds extremely it sounds more wrong than a note like a fifth up might sound. And I think that's because it's so close, it's so almost right that your ear, even the untrained ear, is like kind of makes a face like, oh god, that's off, that's dissonant. And if you do that for a whole solo, even like the whole structure of what you're doing is off. It just projects a very dissonant sound. If you tried to do something superimposing it like a minor third away, it would sound very weird on a country gig, but it could arguably sound hip. But again, so what I did is I played every solo for about 5 songs until the bass player was like, dude, you gotta cut that out. What's going on here? But even though I had played all these tunes in that way, at the set break, it was the exact same reaction from people in the crowd. While it was going on, people were still loving it, still getting into it, being like, heck yeah, man, like that's awesome. The same exact thing. So I realized in that moment there's an interesting dynamic going on. The kind of getting an inflated ego about playing out and people really digging it. Maybe there's not substance underlying the opinion I've had or the effect I had allowed that to have on me. And I recognized that maybe the maybe the presentation is a bit more important than the performance. And that's how I phrased it. That's how I thought about it back then. And now this has become, as I said today, the thesis or hypothesis that we're investigating in this conversation. Maybe it's the case that the style is more important than the substance.
Maybe it's the power of alcohol.
So actually, yeah, I guess that's true too. And that's as I mentioned, and I put together a little treatise on this thought for us to mull over together. But yeah, that is a potential externality that was unaccounted for. And it also can be the case that the collective just wanting to have a good time is more powerful than the analysis. I think I am someone, actually I know because I've had people say this to me before, but I'm one of those people who gets a little lost in my opinion and thinking like, oh, like just analyzing something instead of having a good time. And that's no way to be. And I definitely don't want this podcast, this talk we're having could definitely go that route. So I don't want to go that route and just being very cynical about pointing and looking at things and drawing the finger, or, pointing the finger. But I do think even if that's true and that's part of the dynamic at play, I think there is something about that style over substance problem, if you want to call it a problem, phenomenon, that is nonetheless valid and is going on.
Do you think that same phenomenon would apply, say, at a symphony? Or is that something conducive mainly to the tavern bar scene?
I think that's a pretty interesting question. I think certain things weed out a symphony. There's somewhat of a barrier to entry because most people who are going to take the time to go to a symphony are going to go there knowing what to expect, and they're going to go there. The people who like high music, we might call it, as opposed to low music, and that's not meant to be pejorative. That's just I think anyone would understand what I mean by that. But that high music, it requires something of you. It requires you to go in willing to listen to something very complex, where certain things in pop music, the simplicity and engageability, if you will, of the music does a fair amount of the lifting.
Well, Jacob, one of the things you mentioned that just fascinated me, it's one of the most fascinating conversations I've actually ever had, was when we were at Monte Cristo smoking cigars, and there was a jazz guitarist there.
I do not confirm that I was ever there.
Oh, okay. Well, I was there.
But go ahead.
You were just drinking water. And there
Yeah.
was a jazz guitarist there who you said was virtuoso like, just an awesome performer. But you made the point that it was like almost the substance was almost overkill. Like the musician was so good that it overshot the crowd. And you said that the most effective musicians oftentimes aren't the best. That you have to kind of dial it down or tone it down, and that's where you have enhanced popularity. Is that a similar phenomenon to what you're addressing now?
Yeah, I think so. I forgot about that. That was an interesting conversation we had that day. That I guess that actually. So I think this is what I said then, because I have thought about that a bit, but not in a while. But I think there's this level of where something's, so there's kind of three levels. At the bottom, there's stuff that's not good, and no one's gonna dig it. Like if you're out, if there's not kind of a social gathering or alcohol involved, anyone who's listening in the right mind is going to not think this is cool. But then in the middle tier, there's stuff that's pretty darn good. It's awesome. And there's gradations there, certainly. But in that middle tier, it's good, but it's not too good. It doesn't require so much of you that you have to work listening to it. Like a symphony, anyone can enjoy it on a certain level, but it it does require you as the listener to do a bit of work and paying attention and saying, "Oh, I think I heard that theme played earlier and now it's being restated, and what an interesting way they've reharmonized under that." And jazz does the same thing. A jazz song is structured such that typically they you begin with what they call the head of the song. So you start with the theme, the melody, and then you play that once through. And then the rest of the song, people are trading solos and they're interpreting the melody. And there's sort of an implied, unspoken agreement between the band and the audience that the audience is meant to remember the melody as it goes as they're playing it, so that the band so that they recognize the ways in which the band are, and the individual instruments, individual soloists are reinterpreting that melody. And so that's what is going on when a lot of people say jazz just sounds like noise. Well, point taken, but part of that is that you're meant to be being mindful of the context that would allow that solo to be heard properly, so that it wouldn't be thought of as just noise, but it would be thought of as, oh, that's a reinterpretation of the melody. And so that when you get into that kind of true jazz territory, you start pushing up to that third level where there's stuff that's so good, like there's reinterpretation happening on a level that it requires so much of the audience that the average person can't understand what's going on, or maybe just the setting in which it's being played. It isn't geared towards someone paying enough attention to say, oh wow, like that's awesome. So with regard to that particular jazz guitarist, he's playing background music, and there's a level of that on which everyone in the room can enjoy it. There's a level where it's, oh, this is nice guitar happening in the background, it's great. But then there's another level where if you're really paying attention, you see, oh wow, like look at that, look at the way he's presented the melody, and look at the way he's reharmonizing, and look at the way he's changing this note here to a C instead of a B flat, or whatever. And so to conclude that part, there's a low level where nobody's going to like it. There's a middle level where it's widely acceptable, and then there's something up top which I like, a tier elite level that is, I suppose, in a sense elitist, but that is, there's a threshold to entry, and so it's going to keep a lot of people out of that.
So the idea is the
And I
middle
think
level
kind
is
of,
where you have both good substance but also good style. So there's almost synchronicity between the substance and the style. It's not necessarily style over substance or substance over style. There's a mixture. Whereas if you go to the highest level and it's all substance, there may be not enough style.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one way to think of it. I think using those terms as, there's a lot of gradation in between those two, certainly, and presenting the hypothesis of this discussion is partly a necessary shorthand, but those terms, using them just as poles and exclusive binaries, can be limiting. But in that middle section, I'd say there's big gradations, right? There's very simple, which I'm not saying this is a bad thing, a simple pop song, and then a very complex kind of fusion rock song or fusion R&B song that is still not so involved and not so out that it's available to a popular audience. But those kind of exist as the bottom and the top of that kind of middle range. I would think, and that's just one person's opinion. I am a musician, but I certainly have no monopoly on musical input by any means, and don't want to present myself as such.
I think that it's important to, like, from an English background in literature critique, it's really important to understand uh, genre characteristics and, what's appropriate and where. Like, what's an appropriate theme to have in a horror book versus a satire book, things like that. I think it can apply to music as well. Kind of like what Jake was saying, is we don't necessarily have to have value judgments based on certain preferences. And, we don't have to get critical about certain things, like being overly simplistic, because I think there's a time and a place for it. Kind of like what we were talking about, and Hudson was talking about with, sometimes it's just fun to have some drinks at a dive bar and listen to some music, and who really cares if it's being played a half step up or down or whatever. You're just there to have a good time. Um, but I think kind of bringing it back to the hypothesis is that we're afraid now that everything is becoming like lowered down, like the lowest common denominator. Like, to think about, well, I guess if we're keeping it like music, yeah, like, you're just listening to pop music all the time, and certain things like classical music become seemingly inaccessible, or jazz becomes seemingly inaccessible because it's such an active listening experience. But it's only because so much of the population has like literally zero musical know-how. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's kind of like the matter of fact at this
Yeah, going
point.
back a few decades, I'm a musical neophyte, really, compared to you two, probably. Uh, but like Billy Ray Cyrus, "Achy Breaky Heart," like the lyrics are so simple and the song is so insipid, but it's like massively popular. Like, and I'm sitting here listening to this, and I'm like, this is insane. Why is this so popular? And I don't know how that fits into the hypothesis, but I find a lot of modern music
Well, I
to
think
be shit, and you know, I don't know.
yeah, well, I think that's like it's almost passe or something to say that now. And we're not trying, certainly all three of us, we discussed going into this, we're not trying to make this a focus on just taking that perspective, but I think a lot of people about different things would think that about certain pieces or certain tunes. And there's somebody who might think "Achy Breaky Heart" is like the most meaningful song there ever was to them. And so in some sense there's no accounting for it, and this hypothesis is subject to that criticism. And as Sam said, I guess there's, if someone were to propose a counter hypothesis and say, or to criticize this hypothesis and say just what you just said, sometimes you want to just have a drink and not worry about it. And I don't really have a response to that to overcome that criticism. But as Sam also mentioned, it does seem to be the case that there's a diminution in value or something like that. And I don't want to just get on the cynical kind of sitting back again, shooting from the hip, saying, "Oh man, everything's
No, it's
crap
fun that
today."
way.
But I do have a thought. I have a well, that's not very deep listening material, but I do have a thought about why it may seem that way, or if that is the case, and maybe that's not the case. But if that's the case, I would have a thought as to why that might be the case. Now, on that three-part, that tripartite, to use a big unnecessary law school word, formula for like it's just intolerably bad, that levels of good and it's engageable to totally not engageable. This goes back to the idea of, I've heard it called the Matthew principle. Like, to those who have, more will be given, and to those who lack, even what they lack will be taken away. Even what little they have will be taken from them. That's a loose quote of the Bible. But anyway, the idea being that those who have more attention to the style, the type of music that gets more attention, is going to get more and more attention. And the style that's difficult, there's a very rigid barrier to entry that's very difficult to engage. It's going to be engaged with less and less and less, because people don't want to do the work again to engage with it. And maybe that can't be held against people, or shouldn't be held against people. Who am I to say? But I think in the age of social media, where a lot of the content with which we engage is generated or presented to us by algorithm, the stuff that is already hitting, that is in fact the lowest common denominator, the thing that most people are going to be into, is going to be presented to us just like anybody else. And so the stuff that would maybe be the highest uncommon denominator is going to be weeded out just by a matter of algorithmic convenience, or
And I think
something
we
like
also
that.
have to temper
And
the discussion with what has been called sort of the eye of the beholder phenomenon. You know, to take it sort of
certainly,
legalistically, right? What's one of the famous First Amendment phrases we wrote about in Fixed Stars? In the words of Justice John Marshall Harlan's, a second quote: "One man's vulgarity is another's lyric." Right? What may be
absolutely.
melodious to me may be quite discordant to you, and vice versa. So I think we have to always be cognizant of the fact that we all have our own unique styles and tastes, and some people love hip hop music, some people think it stinks. Some people love country music, some people are repulsed by it. It's really a very individualistic endeavor with musical taste.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to wrap up this section. I would also, I guess actually I'm going to wrap it up now with something else, but kind of building on that. My thought to that, now taking it back to where we began this section, what I tried to do that day with that country band is I tried to make something objectively bad. So what I was doing that day was intentionally, on our 3-part formula, I was in the lowest category, and doing so intentionally. And maybe it was the drinks, maybe it was the atmosphere, or maybe it was the case that the style of what was happening, that we kind of looked the part that day, maybe that overcame the lack of substance. Maybe the style of it looking a certain way compensated for the fact that there was something objectively, and I'm talking about myself, what I was intentionally trying to do was make something objectively bad, and I wasn't able to do it, to communicate this is bad to the people, because there was something bigger happening that was saying overlook
Did that
this.
bother you
And
as an
so,
artist, though? The fact that the reality sets in, that there are a lot of people that aren't appreciating your true artistic gifts because they're like, yeah.
absolutely. I mean, like I said, I kind of had a bit of an ego at that time, and so part of my problem was my identity was too rooted in myself trying to be a musician. So it was kind of like a shattering thing for me. I suppose you could say that speaks to my fragile worldview or something like that, or inappropriately calibrated priorities. But yeah, it was disheartening a bit, and it's something that people. So I don't necessarily think that's a novel observation. I mean, that's something people have been talking about with art with a long time, but I realized it in a very intense way that day, and I mean, you met me in law school, so wound up going to law school, so I took it hard over several years. But anyway, so I mentioned earlier, let's move on to kind of our next topic. I mentioned earlier that I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, And this article is so this is an idea I've been kicking around for a while, thinking about it, but never really wrote about it. And in anticipation of this conversation, I wrote about it. And the thing that inspired me to do that was reading this article about the Logan Paul Floyd Mayweather fight, and particularly the last sentence, or the last paragraph of this, or a couple sentences, really speaks just right to this style versus substance debate. And I'm really going to let Hudson do most of the talking here, because I'll have him speak to his boxing credentials, but he is actually a pro boxing judge. He's the real deal. And without further ado, I'm going to read what Jason Gay, I believe is his name, wrote about this fight. He wrote, "This is how an attention economy works. Some things are considered successful not because they are especially worthwhile or even interesting, but because they generate traffic. The clicks the clicks are the thing. Mere punchers don't stand a chance." And with that, David, maybe you want to talk to us a bit about your background in boxing, some of the writing you've done, and then tell us what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I've been involved with boxing a long time. The great writer Jack Newfield once said that boxing was his, quote, guilty pleasure. And I guess I would fall in that category. But I've been judging professional boxing bouts since 1997. I've judged about 13 or 14 world title fights. And I was a boxing journalist for a time. I've written a few boxing books, including the Boxing's Most Wanted, the Top 10 book of Champs, Chumps, and Punch Drunk Palookas, the Combat Sports Encyclopedia, and Boxing in America, an Autopsy. So I truly am a fan of the sport they call the sweet science. And for purists of the sport, it is a bit difficult to swallow the popularity of a gross exhibition match between Logan Paul, a YouTuber, boxing Floyd Money Mayweather, who retired as a professional boxer with an undefeated record of 50-0, and is universally acclaimed as one of the top pound for pound great boxers of all time. But he's 44 years old, and he's fighting a guy in his 20s who outweighs him by 40 pounds, and the guy's just not a boxer. And the fact that Logan Paul can make $20, $25 million for this spectacle, whereas great fighters, great boxers can't command that type of purse. And so it really does speak to Jacob and Sam's thesis about style sometimes does weigh out over substance, because the fight was a joke. Floyd didn't even throw a punch in the first round, and Logan Paul was as Floyd said in the post-fight press conference, he was mainly a grabber, not a fighter. He was a master at holding. But let me attest, I don't know if either one of you have ever heard of Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford is a boxer from Omaha, Nebraska, who's an undefeated welterweight, and he's been a champion for about 8-9 years. And most of the public doesn't know who he is. Errol Spence Jr., you may know because he's from Texas, but he's also an undefeated champion, and a lot of the larger public doesn't know who he is. Now, part of this is the phenomenon that boxing has lost a lot of its popular appeal. Boxing hasn't been extremely popular since the days of Iron Mike Tyson, who was the youngest man. Michael Gerard Tyson was the youngest man ever to capture the World Heavyweight Championship. But from about 1986 to 1990, 91, he was the dominant force in the heavyweight division, and everybody knew Mike Tyson, right? Well, now Mike Tyson fights an exhibition against Roy Jones Jr., and that garners more attention than a lot of real boxing fights. Now, it's true that there have always been these sort of spectacle exhibitions. Muhammad Ali once fought an exhibition fight against a famous Japanese wrestler, and the fight degenerated into the Japanese wrestler laying on the ground, flailing around his kicks, and Ali dancing around doing the Ali shuffle. But something really interesting happened with this Logan Paul Floyd Mayweather spectacle, and that is some real fighters, UFC fighters, for example, said, why aren't we making this type of money? Why is Logan Paul getting $20 million and we're in here doing real fights and we're not commanding anywhere near that purse? So boxing, the Logan Paul Floyd Mayweather spectacle is a pristine example of style over substance, because there wasn't much substance to that fight at all. And there should be much more attention, I think, paid to great fights, which happen all the time in boxing. And a lot of people just don't see them. They don't know them.
I think,
I still,
yeah, I think this is like kind of the crux of it, is that like people don't really care about boxing like that. The people who are watching that fight don't really care about boxing, right? Like Logan Paul is serving as a walking advertisement. I think of the South Park episode where like the advertisements take over and become humans, and like that is Logan Paul. Kind of like what the writer was saying from that article. Like the click is the purpose. That's the end goal. The end goal here is not to produce a quality boxing event. The goal here is to sell
Yeah, to that
advertising
extent,
dollars.
right? They're wildly
And
successful. It's
yeah.
in his younger brother Jake Paul is now doing the same thing. Jake Paul just beat a former UFC fighter, Ben Askren, and now he's getting ready to fight another former UFC champion, Tyron Woodley. Now, I will give the Paul brothers credit. Apparently, they are taking boxing seriously, like they're actually diligently training. So Logan Paul did go the distance with Floyd Mayweather. So to even go the distance with Floyd Mayweather, we got to give him some credit. He obviously had some pretty good cardio, and he's put himself in pretty good shape. And by all accounts, they actually train. But yeah, the Wall Street Journal writer's absolutely right.
well,
It's
I'm
the
looking at
number
the
of
picture
clicks.
of the guy here, and yeah, it is interesting because the dude, and I've seen pictures of his brother too, like freaking jacked, look like boxers. I mean, it's just, it's a lot of people watching, I suppose, similar to what may be the music analogy I was talking about, don't know the difference, don't care. And if that happens in the aggregate, may deprive themselves and others of actually engaging with the real thing on as many with they might well let me see they might dilute the real thing to the extent that it's harder to find the real thing. And what Mr. Gay noted about that, and I think he was not saying this himself, but saying that many folks felt this way in the boxing community, that they thought it was, quote, bad for the sport, that exhibition goofs like Mayweather versus Paul cannibalize the legitimate stuff and undermine efforts to lift the product.
Is it true? Like, I'm trying to draw a parallel here with music and boxing. Is it true that a lot of talented musicians were kind of upset and recoiled at the popularity of American Idol? Which many people think is the greatest television show of all time. Is it Ruben or Clay? And there are no doubt some talented musicians that came out of it, but a lot of really people in the industry really recoiled and resented the popularity of American Idol, correct?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it's kind of, you go out to jams and stuff, and people certainly have strong opinions, but a lot of people do it who have those opinions. And I think people who have those opinions, and I'm going to include myself in this, there's an aspect of disdain for things like that are born of jealousy or envy. Like it's just how it is. And I'm certainly not going to present myself as though my thoughts about certain things like that are completely devoid of that more sinister is not the right word, but improper motive or something like that, influence. But I do think there is a bit of, well, I guess first of all, I think anytime you structure art into a competitive framework so explicitly, you're kind of losing something to it, which that doesn't parallel with boxing.
Well, a true boxer, the most talented boxer of all time, like a Sugar Ray Robinson or a Willie Pep or a Floyd Mayweather in his time, is a supreme artist in the ring. The ability to be able to throw fluid combinations, but yet to avoid and slip punches is really watching an artist. So there are, I guess it's that supreme talent is what I think a lot of us appreciate. You take supreme talent in any arena, they're geniuses in the boxing ring and they're music geniuses, and that's something that's what I like to see. I like to see people who are at the
Yeah, to
peak of
see.
their prowess.
Yeah, I think to watch something to someone who's truly mastered anything, even if it's like you see guys on the street drawing in chalk and they're truly
Well, that's why you
masters,
hung
and
out
it's
with me
just
a lot when
amazing.
we go shoot pool,
And it,
because you got to see an artist and a master at work.
it's true,
I
but
think
you're not undefeated.
Yeah,
I will
occasionally we have to
remind
give
you.
charity to the people. We have to help the downtrodden
Magnanimous
and
of
help the
you.
little people.
Well, let me pose this counter argument to the criticism of the
Yeah,
Paul Mayweather fight, which is that it's not that a lot of the viewers who were watching that night were not viewers who were lost. It's not like they took those viewers from another legitimate boxing match, but rather they're viewers who came for that only, and they might not stay for other
that's an
boxing, and
excellent
maybe
point.
they
They
even
actually
will.
put
But
that
it's not
fight
like
on a
they
Sunday
actually took
night,
something.
whereas most primetime boxing events are on a Friday or Saturday nights. They're absolutely correct. They did put that on a Sunday evening, which I think was intentional, and maybe that was somewhat respectful of the sport. I don't know, but I think Sam hit it on the head, unfortunately, and it pains me that he said it. But he was dead on correct that boxing has lost a lot of its popularity. It's become a niche sport. But I'll tell you that the Paul brothers have also impacted. Look at Dana White talking about it, how much it infuriates Dana White. He gets sick and tired of hearing questions about, Jake Paul beating Ben Askren, and now Jake Paul fighting, fighting Tyron Woodley. Oscar De La Hoya, at 48 years old, announced he's going to have a fight with 44-year-old Vitor Belfort, a former UFC champion. So they've just started this parade of horribles, so to speak, of these past their prime fighters holding these exhibitions. It's kind of. But Sam hit it on the head. Like, boxing,
free
unfortunately,
market
has lost its
capitalism.
popularity. We need more people to appreciate. We need another Mike Tyson. Honestly, is what we need. We need a dominant American heavyweight champion. We thought Deontay Wilder might be that, and then Tyson Fury kind of beat the crap out of him in their rematch. But but it does sometimes come in cycles too.
I was watching a Netflix documentary a few years ago, and they were suggesting that there might be somewhat of a boxing renaissance happening, just because it's a cheap sport for people to get into. So if you don't have a lot of money, you can join a boxing gym. But they had a quote that I think about pretty regularly, both in regards to fighting and not to fighting. But they said it used to be that we took fighters and made them into athletes, and that became a boxer. But now it's athletes chasing money that we train to be fighters, and that's who the boxers are. So then I thought about this. I was like, well, now we're taking YouTubers and training them to be boxers so they can make even more money. But it just back to the style over substance things. It's like Logan Paul, like I think from start to finish, like coming in with the Pokemon card around his neck. um, I think there's just like a lot of symbolism, kind of like even the point that Jake was making with he looks the part, he looks ripped, he like has a symbolism in his body, he has a symbolism of like fame or internet fame like around his neck with the Pokemon card. He's just like attributing all these symbols to himself to like give the air that he is somebody who is famous, who like otherwise has no fame, right? Like kind of like a Hilton almost, or the Jenner's,
Kardashian.
like famous for being famous. And so he's trying to like associate him, like buy his way into these other arenas. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think the symbolism carries a lot of weight here.
Well, I think that actually leads very well into the next thing we're going to talk about, which is this was a crucial for me in develop and kind of thinking about this idea over the past 8 years or however long it's been. Not too long ago, I think this would have been during so probably like 5 years ago. It's an old piece, but I read this book. It's in a book of essays called "A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again." I believe it's by David Foster Wallace, who is known primarily as the author of Infinite Jest. And if anyone has seen the well, no, it's not a documentary, but the dramatization, The End of Tour, I believe it's called, that covers him. I think a lot of people saw that. Very interesting guy, but he wrote this essay called A Unibus Plurum, which is an inversion of the A Pluribus Unum, from many one. Now he points out to this idea from one many, and kind of the images from one many, and it's in the image of that one. And there's a lot in this essay that it just wouldn't be possible at all to talk about it here in its entirety, but I'm going to focus on some narrow points. And what he wrote this essay, the collection was published in 1997, but the end of the essay indicates that it was written in 1990. So he wrote this 30 and change years ago. Incidentally, the year I was born, for those who may be interested. But he's talking about television, and he begins by talking about himself as a writer and fiction writers generally. And I think this could be applied to artists generally. But he talks about how fiction writers have a voyeuristic tendency. They tend to be oglers. I believe is the word he uses. He talks about how they sit looking uncannily at people on a park bench, or I think the subway actually is what he says. But they look at life and they observe life and glean something from it. And that's their fiction, their research they're doing, so that they can extrapolate something from life to then put it into their book and give it to us, give us the meaningful parts in their writing. But what's interesting that happens with television is television became increasingly popular, increasingly commonplace, increasingly we became inundated with interacting with TVs. I think at the time he was writing, he mentions something like the average American household has a TV on for 6 hours a day, something like that. And so what we're seeing is not what the fiction writers are interacting, the thing they're observing and ogling and trying to understand that they can use to put in their writing is not life itself, but is rather a representation of life. So it's almost as though we're not doing to analogize it to photography. It's not that we're taking pictures anymore, but we're taking pictures of pictures, and we don't realize that what we're looking at is not a picture, but a picture of a picture. And what happens is we become increasingly removed. And so he also talks about in this essay the idea of watchableness. And he talks about how increasingly it becomes the case that the most heroic, the American hero, becomes someone who can be watched. I'm going to find this exact quote. Yes, so he says this. He says, we receive unconscious reinforcement of the deep thesis that the most significant quality of truly alive persons is watchableness, and that genuine human worth is not just identical with, but rooted in the phenomenon of watching. I'm going to say that again because I kind of stumbled on it. We receive the unconscious reinforcement of the deep thesis that the most significant quality of truly alive persons is watchableness, and that genuine human worth is not just identical with, but rooted in the phenomenon of watching. Plus the idea that the single biggest part of real watchableness is seeming to be unaware that there's any watching going on, acting natural. So these people who become the heroes in our society and our art and our culture are those who are the most watchable. And an interesting thought, I think that's pulling enough out of his essay for purposes here. There's more in the writing if anyone wants to check out the writing that's going to be posted to our site. But what's interesting, he was talking about television. So he was talking about something that is very large and sits in the corner. Now in the age of social media, where we are taking the television with us and there's just tons of material that can be presented to us at any time, how much more are we succumbing to being just geared towards being interested in what's watchable? And when something becomes watchable, as I was mentioning earlier, it becomes watched more and more. And so that the style of that thing, regardless of saying anything about the substance, maybe there are, I mean, undoubtedly there are very substantial things that become very popular. But there are also, I don't think anyone would dispute that there are very insubstantial things lacking substance that become very popular. And when they become popular, they become imitated. I mean, even us, I'm certainly not going to pretend that we Sam and I, as we were looking at how to start a podcast, start this channel, we looked at what do you do to kind of get the word out, to get things going. And a lot of that was geared towards stylistic imitations of things. And we'll probably do that to some extent. We'll probably choose not to do that to some extent, maybe to our detriment. But it's interesting that Wallace talked about this dynamic when we consider social media and how intense it is, how consuming it is. He was noting this dynamic happening in a very rudimentary place, but now this dynamic of self removal, of just imitating that which is watchable, the unibus plurum, the one thing that gets popularity, that gets latched onto, becomes duplicated, and things are created in its image. How much more intense and successful is the proliferation of style over
But
substance
Jacob, I will say, just as there are great writers like Wallace, there's also great writing in television, right? So, for example, The Wire.
Certainly,
The Wire is artful. So, one of the writers for The Wire is Richard Price, who's the author of Clockers and all sorts of great novels, but he's also a writer of television. The show Rectify on Sundance, written by Ray McKinnon, that's art, right? So there is a beauty in the ability to tell a story, whether that's as an author of a book or a screenplay or a television drama. And that's it's very rare, but David Simon was a writer, right, for many years with the Baltimore Sun, and he produced classic. I mean, they teach college courses on The Wire now, right? So it's not that television itself is an adulteration or bastardization of writing. There's actually incredible writing on television, right?
Right. I certainly wouldn't present those as like a hard and fast rule. Sorry to interrupt you, Sam, but I just would say, again, just as we're talking about music and alluded to during box, those, like, it can't be a hard and fast rule. It's either good or bad, but rather I'm just talking about, I think what I'm getting at through reinterpreting Wallace is that there are shortfalls that are inevitable effects, maybe, that will come from the medium, regardless of to say that some people might
the medium is the message
and amazing things through the medium.
I think Wallace is wrong here about television. I think he's maybe right about reality television, if that's what he's looking at. I think he would have been profoundly right when it comes to YouTube vloggers like Logan Paul. Like, The Wire is an excellent product. Like, that is art, and there's a reason why people buy it or pay subscriptions to HBO to watch it. Nobody is paying to watch YouTube. It's a free thing, and so, like, I think the quality of the product is way lower. Like a stupid vlog on what you did, some crazy thing you did in LA. Like, honestly, who cares? And I think if you made people pay for it, you would see that nobody cares. But because it's free, a lot of people are watching it, and you make that click farm. And so now and this is going to be so critical, and I don't mean it to be this like sinister, but you have a bunch of people fancying themselves as content creators or storytellers or something. It's like, listen, you produce vlogs that I think otherwise nobody would buy, but the only reason why people are like, why you are able to do it is because you're shilling out some product for some sponsored video. And it's like, you are a walking advertisement. Like, you're not a storyteller. And I think that's like I think that's a crazy profound difference between something like The Wire versus a Logan Paul vlog. And not to go full, Holden Caulfield on it and just call everybody phony. That's on YouTube, but that's a pretty firm stance that I'm willing to take.
So one, I think those are points well taken, and I suppose Hudson, you came more with a direct counter argument to an extent. One thing that I would present as I think a very strong counter evidence to my reinterpretation or transposition of Wallace's ideas into today's world is that the proliferation of social media and the various platforms there have allowed a level of sincerity and not just style, but almost substance completely devoid of style. So, what I mean by that is that someone can have a very pixelated video with poor audio quality, and yet they're talking about something interesting, and those people develop small followings or maybe even big followings, but niche followings and grow from there. And in a sense, it's like we have the opportunity for the maximum sincerity. There's the opportunity to engage with something because you like it, but you don't. It doesn't have to be polished and beautiful and excellent the way TV became, because it just has to look good for any network to pick it up or something. Now anyone can be their own little network on YouTube, and if you're saying something interesting, you're doing something eccentric and you don't care about the style, you're just being yourself and people latch onto it and love it. That's possible now in a way that it wouldn't have been possible. So in a sense, it almost inverts that watchableness, where the only watchable things are that which are deemed watchable already. It almost inverts that paradigm in some sense. And I think that's a powerful counterpoint, or not counterpoint, but counter argument to what I'm presenting. And I think it's also, again, I think it's possible for two things to be existing at the same time. What my concern would be in responding to the response I presented to myself is that style is much more alluring. The more basic music that maybe takes some attention from what could be more complex and rich and beautiful music, it's easier to deal with, to engage with that music that's kind of at the lower end of that middle section than the stuff at the higher pushing onto that third tier. And in the aggregate, that makes that leaves less time, less attention, less funding for the stuff that's of what we might say is a greater caliber. And in the same way, I think there's some things about YouTube, as you're getting stuff suggested to you because it's already been deemed watchable. A lot of that's going to be generated by its stylistic appeal, and that could be defined a lot of different ways. Whereas something that might give you a greater connection with someone across the world, that might make you feel better, that might bless you more or stimulate your intelligence more. There's something about the style that stimulates you on a physiological level that wins out. And
I think a prime example of that is like clickbait. Like people have a thumbnail that's uh, really catchy with a title that's really catchy, that's often untrue or maybe not even totally related to the video itself, but it's so it's shock value just to pull you in to get you to click on the video, and then shortly into the video you learn, oh, this actually isn't the case. The the thing that they were saying in the title is actually untrue, and they just got me. Now I'm a sucker. Now I've just given them however much advertising dollars.
yeah, and your attention was the advertising
So
dollar.
yeah, that's the epitome of zero substance, all style.
Well, I think that's, unless either of y'all have anything else, I think we've beaten the horse, as they say.
Indeed, that
All
is a
right.
dead horse.
Well, anyone who, we had a couple of things on here, but I think we'll leave them for the writing. as we've gone on a bit longer than we had intended to. But anyone who stuck with us, we thank you. And again, the hypothesis is that one of our biggest cultural issues we're facing is a preference for style over substance. We will leave it with you to be the judge, and thank you for joining us as we kind of hashed it out. And not sure we got any closer to defining whether that's a valid or invalid hypothesis, but enjoyed talking about it with
Thank
both
you.
of you. Thanks for your thoughts and time.
Thank you.
All right, this is the Fixed Star. We'll see you next time.